What's up, EduGamers? Today we're going to look at some tips for using board games in your classroom. I'm going to go over 5 tips and give you some concrete examples of how you can use games or board games for learning to create a more engaging and playful learning environment. Let's do it. So I'm Dustin from Board Gaming with Education. This is a VideoCast episode. VideoCast? You have a podcast? Yes. If you're listening to this on the podcast, you already know that. But if you are on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. If you're listening to the podcast, come on over to YouTube and be sure to subscribe to our channel. We are going to be releasing content like this moving forward into Season 12 of Board Gaming with Education. So this is kind of a preview of what the podcast will look like, or in your case, if you're listening on the podcast, what it will sound like moving forward. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel or keep listening on the podcast. You'll still get a lot of great conversations, great interviews, and discussions about games for learning. All right, so let's jump into the topic for today. So let's frame the discussion for today's topic. We're looking at modern board games for learning. So let's break down 3 things. First, let's start with board games. When I say board games, I don't necessarily mean games that have a board. It could be a game with dice, could be a game with cards, it could be a game with boards, but these are analog-based games. Number 2 I want to look at is modern. So when I say modern, I'm not talking about games like Clue or Monopoly or Sorry. These are games that have some value and can be used for game-based learning. However, we're going to really look at some modern board games that came out in the last 10 years or so, because I think they really build on those mechanics in the past and make for a more engaging experience. And then number 3 is we're looking at modern board games for learning. So when I'm talking about learning, I'm talking about specifically targeting learning outcomes. You can subscribe to our channel. You can check out our podcast. Go to boardgamewitheducation.com. We talk about all the positive aspects that board games and games for learning have. Also, we look at some maybe challenges or negative aspects as well. So if you want to hear conversations around that, be sure to subscribe to our channel or follow us at boardgamewitheducation.com. But we're going to look at targeted learning outcomes and tips that we can use for using board games in our classroom. So tip number 1, modifying the game. First, I want to iterate again why I put this as the first tip, because we're looking at games for learning. So if we're changing the rules of the game, don't worry too much, because the ultimate goal of using board games in our classroom is targeting learning outcomes. So if the game experience changes a little bit, that's not a big deal, because we can probably still create a fulfilling and engaging learning experience through the board game. So an oversimplified modification to the rules is you could set a time limit on the game. So you don't have to have your students play through the entire game, or you can have them stop after a certain round. Another thing that a lot of games do, and you can check some of your games, they might have some beginner rules. So these are ways to make the game more accessible to new players. A game company that actually has an entirely separate game is Evolution. So North Star Games created Evolution, and they also developed a game called Evolution The Beginning. So it's a modified version of Evolution that eliminates some of the game mechanics in Evolution and still creates a very engaging game experience. And it's also a game that's more accessible to new players. So look at some games that you have and look at some of the mechanics or game rules you can maybe eliminate in the game and see if the game still plays pretty well. Again, though, going back to the main idea of using board games in our classroom is for learning. So if it changes the game experience, it may still be very engaging game experience, but it might be a different game. But that's okay. We're looking at games for learning. Tip number 2, scaffolding the game. So a lot of us who are teachers are probably familiar with this term, but for anyone that's not or still learning the teaching practice, well, scaffolding is breaking learning down into chunks and providing a tool and structure for those learning chunks. So we can do this with teaching the game. So we might be able to do this in 2 different ways, or a couple different ways. There's probably more, but one way is to give our students a pre-practice or pre-activity before they come to class. So we do this with a lot of stuff already. We might ask them to watch a how-to play video of the game or read the rule book. And then after they had done one of those two things, they can answer comprehension questions about how to play the game. What we can also do with scaffolding is to break the actual gameplay down into different pieces. So we might introduce a part of the gameplay and then have students play that part. And then after they get that part down, we go into the next part of the game. I do this with the game Trap Words, and this is something I'll mention later in this topic. Is Trap Words is a game like the game Taboo. If you're not familiar with Taboo, you have to ask your team to guess your word. So the word might be apple, and you have certain words you cannot say to help your team guess your word. So maybe you can't say red, you cannot say Washington, you cannot say tree, you cannot say fruit. So you have to think of ways to get your team to guess the word apple without saying those words. So that is Taboo. I have my students play a quick round of Taboo as one demonstration, an example of how to play that game. And then afterwards, we move into Trap Words. We learn a mechanic for the game Trap Words, and that's where the other team is coming up with those words you cannot say. So then I introduce that idea to them, and then we move a little bit further into the game of Trap Words. There are a couple other rules in that game that I go over as well. Another game that does this in its kind of scaffolding through the game of learning as well as Monikers. So Monikers is a really cool game. You get a stack of cards and you try to work through those cards. The first thing you can do to get your team to guess that clue, you can say anything related to that clue. The next round, you can only say one word. And then the last round is you can act out the actions to get your team to guess the clue. So with Monikers, it's kind of cool because it's looking at that scaffolding process for memory of those content or those content specific vocabulary that you can use in the game. Tip number 3, tie in additional activities to the game. So one popular technique that you could use to be able to do this is introduce stations. So stations is where you divide your class up into groups and students go from one station to the next, to the next, to the next. So out of those stations, 3 of them can be tied into the game. So like my previous tip, station number 1, you can have them watch a how to play video, have them read the rule book, and answer comprehension questions on how to play. Station number 2 is where they actually play the game. You might also ask them to preview station 3's activity as a part of station 2. And then station 3 is where you have them do the additional activity. So you can develop a lot of different activities, comprehension questions based on the game. You can develop other content. For example, at BoardGameWithEducation.com, we develop learning resources for different board games we carry on our website. One game we look at is Element Poker. Element Poker is pretty cool. It's a innovative, change of 52 card deck. So in Element Poker, there are 52 elements from the periodic table of elements. And we've developed a learning activity to help them practice with the periodic table. So you could do some sort of activity that ties into the game. Another activity you can have them do that is a bit more involved, but I encourage you to try this out because it really taps into your ability to see if your students are understanding the content that you've covered in class, and that's by creating a game based on the game they played. So again, BoardGameWithEducation.com, we have a game where we carry the educational line of games of Fluxx. So this is a very simple card game. It's draw one, play one, very much like an Uno style game, but the game is always in flux. There are rules changing. I recommend checking out the game at our website if you want to learn more about how to play. But what we have on the website for an extra activity is asking students to develop a game based on some of those educational line of games. So there's chemistry Fluxx, astronomy Fluxx, nature Fluxx, anatomy Fluxx, and developing cards based on the game that they already played. So really great activity you can tie into the game as well. Tip number 4 is gamifying the content through the game. So this is kind of getting into a technical difference between gamification and game-based learning. And if you're curious about the difference or what game-based learning is specifically, there'll be a link down below to check out what is game-based learning. So looking at what this means. So taking a game, an oversimplified example of this is taking a game like Uno and asking students to answer a question before playing their card. So the content is not where they are learning, it's the overlaying of these questions on the game. So you can do this with a lot of different games in clever ways. I've seen teachers do this with Jenga. Really cool because it also taps into those learners that really need to be a bit more mobile and move around a bit. But they come up to the classroom, they grab one of the Jenga blocks, and they have to answer a question. And if they answer the question correct, they can put the Jenga block on top and they're safe. So playing Jenga and gamifying the content through the game of Jenga. So another example is the game Happy Salmon. So Happy Salmon is a very silly game where players have to do certain tasks like high five, pound. The last one is Happy Salmon. But a really cool, clever game. And you can gamify that. So you can ask students to answer maybe rapid fire questions that are very much in recall memory, some content you've been covering in class very often, and have them to brush up on some of that while they play the game Happy Salmon. So that is tip number 4, using board games to gamify the content. All right, for tip number 5, and this is actually kind of 3 parts to it. So they're what I call the 3 pillars of a good board game for game-based learning. So first, number 1 is make sure the game is easy to explain. It should not take 15 minutes to explain the game in your class. I would say for the most part, we don't have that time in our classrooms to explain how to play the game. So, I mean, if you have a cool enrichment program and it's all about board games for learning, then you can devote some extra time to explaining the game. But really, we want to drill down into being able to explain the game very quickly, very succinctly in our class. And that heavily relies on the game we choose. So, for example, Happy Salmon, if you go to how to play Happy Salmon on YouTube, the video is 1.5 minutes. Explains the game, how to play in 1.5 minutes. Another example, Codenames. So Codenames is a word association game. So you have a 5x5 grid of words. You say a word that's not on that grid, and people have to associate your word with the other words on the grid. And you can give multiple clues. So you could say 3 words are on this grid, and my clue is ... So it's that simple to explain that game. There are some other nuances in there, but you can explain those. It should only take about 5 minutes to explain the game Codenames in class to get your students up and playing the game. That goes into pillar number 2. The game needs to be also quick to play. So Codenames is another perfect example. A round of Codenames, and actually a round is a game. You could play multiple rounds and do best of 5 or whatever, but a round of the game is only 20 minutes about. It could be less. It could be maybe a little bit longer. I wouldn't say you would go more than 20, 25 minutes for a game of Codenames, but there is one mechanic in the game where it can end instantly. So that is something that can make the game a lot shorter. But Codenames is very quick to play, and that's important because we don't have a lot of time usually to devote to using a game in class. And again, this is something I recommend looking into if you are first using game-based learning, because you want it easy to explain, quick to play, so you can try it out and see how it works in your classroom. Now, I know there are some people that can probably devote a game to playing multiple days, and that's something I also encourage. And if you can do that, lean into our tip number 3, which was providing additional activities to really focus in on the learning. Pillar number 3, and this one is, I think, pretty important. Maybe my most important pillar is making sure everyone is involved in the learning and the play almost at all times of the game. So for example, I mentioned the game Trap Words. Trap Words is only a 2-team game. So I go back to rule number 1, I modify the game. I make it 3 teams. Now team number 1, they have the clue. They're trying to get their team to guess the clue. Team number 2 creates the trap words. Team number 3 also knows the trap words, so they're listening for the trap words. And then team number 3 is also in charge of keeping time and counting the number of guesses team number 1 has. So team number 1 in the game of trap words, you only get 5 guesses. So their team number 3 is listening the whole time. They're not really even part of the contest right now, but they're also paying attention because they're thinking about the trap words. They're keeping track of the time, and they're counting the guesses. So that's a way that I've been able to modify the game, make sure everyone's involved in the process. And going back to Codenames, again, everyone's kind of involved. Even the team that's not playing is still kind of thinking through what the words can be because they have the visual of the 5x5 grid to look at. So that is tip number 5, the 3 pillars of a good board game for game-based learning. So check out boardgamewitheducation.com. We have and we curate our selection of board games for Board Games for Learning. So all those games on our site are ones that we've looked at that make for excellent either game-based learning resources or great games for at-home learning, or games that you can play with your family that have some sort of educational angle. And as always, if you have questions, reach out to me, podcast@boardgamewitheducation.com. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And we'll be back next week for the podcast. The VideoCast won't come back until season 12. That will be April. This was just a preview to what it might look like when we do have season 12 of Board Game with Education and the VideoCast. All right, so thank you, and we'll see you soon, and you'll hear from me on the podcast next week.